Okay, so you're here and you're probably wondering how much money does it take to retire? And you've probably heard stories where you need to have $1 million to retire, or now you're hearing stories that you need to have more than $1 million to retire, and that is just not true. It's really not true. Because let's face it, if you've done any amount of work in your life, you're gonna have a pension from the government. And that may not be a ton of money, but at least it's something once you, of course, hit the age of 65 or 67, depending on how old you are, and of course the future when it comes to at least Canada or even the United States. It's not a lot, but at least it's something. And what happens if you want to retire, let's say, earlier in your 40s or maybe your 50s or maybe even in your 30s? I classify myself as retired even though I still technically work. I run my own business. It doesn't feel like work to me. And basically, how much money do you need to be able to actually just not have to work another job in your life? So let's get down and let's actually break down the numbers. So you're going to need a ton of money. You're not going to be able to retire if you have $500 to your name. No matter how old you are, if you only have $500 to your name, you're not going to be able to retire. It doesn't matter if you are 60, 65, or even 20, you're not going to be able to retire. So how much money does it really take? So as an example, if you had $100,000, now that may seem unattainable for most, but if you are at this point and you're trying to figure out how much it actually does take, then you probably will have at least more than that. But let's use 100,000 as a starting point. And let's actually try and break down some numbers for that starting point. So when it comes down to it, there's a few different types of investments, at least up here in Canada, that you can do. And there's very similar down in the States too, where, for example, a TD or a Canadian bank right now is only paying around 3.5%, but historically they generally average somewhere in that 4.5% range. It's just because the Canadian bank stocks have kind of soared recently, and because of COVID, they have not been allowed to raise their dividend. And I always like to get the Canadian banks when they're up in the 5% range. That's usually a good target for me, and that's currently what I'm getting. I'm around 6.5% right now from the Canadian banks. But let's use the current numbers that they have, which is about 3.5%. There's also different covered call options, and of course QYLD in the States, or you can use something like a ZWK up here in Canada, and from there that will give you roughly around 7% from the last time I looked at their dividends. So now we're starting to get a little bit of a wider range. If you went for like a QYLD is usually somewhere in the 10% range, and I'll just check it really quickly. And it's actually currently not at 10%. It's a little bit better and currently pays an 11.8% dividend. So now we're starting to kind of get our grips on how much we will actually need to have. So for an example, if we had TD, we would be getting around $3,500 a year, and that may or may not be enough depending on what's going on with your life. However, for most people, $3,500 is not enough. When it comes to ZWK, you're looking at around $7,000 per year. If I said per month for TD, I meant per year. And at that point, you're starting to get to some serious numbers. And then, of course, with QYLD, you would be at a staggering $11,800 a year. And at that point, depending on what's going on in your life, you could legitimately actually retire on that amount because, of course, you may have other lines of income. So as an example, if you were retired or you're about to retire and you're getting a pension, you would have, of course, the pension coming in, and that would be a pretty good bonus. And if you're in Canada and you've got a TFSA, you could literally get most of that as tax-free income. Right now, I think it's around $75,000 or $76,000 a year that you can put into a TFSA to invest. So most of that could be, about 3/4 of that would be about basically tax-free. And then the last quarter, which would end up being maybe around 20 $2,900 over the year, that would be only taxed, 50% of that would be taxed, which would then make it, let's call it $1,400 taxable, and usually taxed at a lower percentage because, of course, you don't have much other income coming in, so you would be pretty well all set. Now, when it comes down to that number, we can really start inflating this pretty crazy. So, for example, if you had $200,000 instead, so if we moved this to $200K and we had $200,000, well, guess what? These numbers right here, these would all be essentially double. So if you had $200,000, if you just did the TD route, then that would be $7,000. If you did the ZWK route, you would be at $14,000, and then if you had QYLD, you would be at $23,600. And at that point, you're starting to get to an actual retirement amount. This is why I personally really love dividends, because they are usually pretty consistent. You can get ETFs that are covered calls that pay you a exorbitant amount of dividends or yield, and then you can get actual just individual companies like TD, Royal Bank, maybe an Enbridge that pays 6%. Companies like those that will give you a dividend and have a strong history of giving dividends as well. And you really want to have, if you're relying on dividends as income, you really want to make sure that those dividends are solid and will continue to come in or continue to rise at a higher amount than inflation. Inflation is usually 2% or so, and right now you're getting close to 5% because of all the government spending. But either way, usually you will see a big, with the Canadian banks, usually 4 to 6% dividend raise every single year. Enbridge is more closer on average to about 7 to 10%. So when you start looking at things like that, that could be a good route. Now, I always say this, make sure to be diverse. Don't just chuck all your money into a single ETF. Don't just chuck all your money into a single stock, because that is just a recipe for disaster. Same idea as you should never just rely on one job to give you income, because if that job disappears, you no longer have income. That's why I started my YouTube channel. It's so it could be another income source when it comes to what I'm doing. And at that point, that is what that's what everyone should be trying to do. So when I used to work a regular job, I would have my job income, my dividend income, my business income. Now, back then, my business income was really just a single YouTube channel and my basketball training locally. And then I started to expand my business. I've got now 4 channels that are monetized. I'm working on a 5th. And I also have my basketball skills training. I sell PDFs for basketball on my website. I basically try to get into everything. I even have links down below this video where you can purchase my favorite financial books. So things like that, even that Amazon link stuff will work. There are so many different ways that you can monetize whatever you're trying to do. But if you don't start to try to expand your ability to make more money, then eventually it's a recipe for disaster if you only have one income source. So always have multiple income sources. That is my main message for anybody at any age. And so basically, how much do you need to really retire? All you really need depends. It really does depend. If you have no other income source, you're going to need at least about $200,000 to $250,000 to invest to be able to have that money coming in. At the same time, if you're still working, or if you're like me and you run your own business, expand your income sources with your business, and then on top of it all, invest in multiple different stocks and ETFs that can pay you back. And then at that point, you really actually only need around $100,000, which may seem like a ton of money to some people. But I'm going to tell you right now, try to cut back on a lot of stuff that you may be doing. One of the things that one of my friends cut back on was smoking. He used to smoke $5,000 of cigarettes a year. That is ridiculous. And that alone, sure, that could take 20 years to be able to build up 100,000. But guess what? With dividends that are being reinvested and for the stock to appreciate, that is going to really speed up that process. But also, it's not just cigarettes. It could be anything. So for example, going to a party that has maybe a $50 or $100 cover charge just to get into the club or whatever it may be. Do a party at your house and have everyone bring their own liquor. That's free then. And then you can say, well, I'm providing the place. You provide the liquor. I get free liquor. I got my own place. And guess what? We can have fun. And that's a great way to save a massive amount of money. So there is some ideas, and you can save a ton of money by still having fun and essentially not having to really worry about working ever again. Because if you could put away an extra couple $100 or a couple $1,000 a month, that's going to be life-changing. I still remember when I used to work a job and people would literally get their paycheck and it would be like $800 every 2 weeks after taxes, and they'd get their $800 and then they would pay for their cell phone bill, which is like $150 because they had to have the greatest phone with the greatest data plan that they never used at all. And then, and I know this because I did cell phone applications for them, and then they would turn around and spend $200 or $300 out of that $800 the first weekend they got the money and went to the club. And then they would turn around and do the same thing the week after, and then they had to pay a car bill, and then they have to pay rent, and then they can't pay rent, and they it just snowballs. Save your money, invest your money. Save, get enough to invest, and then invest. You don't need to have $100,000 to invest. All you really need is like $150 to $250, or even $50 even. To be honest with you, if you get one of those trading apps that do fractional shares, you can literally just start investing with $5 really. So start your investment journey if you haven't already. This is how much you'll need to invest to basically have a retirement or just start retiring early. And of course, I hope that this video helps. I'll see you guys again next time.